Welcome to episode 19 of Musclebox Radio. So this is the second part of the Cliff Wilson interview. This episode we talk about the art of peaking. So if you haven't listened to episode 18, the art of contest prep, then I would suggest going back into listening to that one. It was a great podcast. Cliff covers some really, really great content, and that will really lead nicely into this next episode. So go back if you haven't listened to it already. You can get it on iTunes or YouTube and then listen to this podcast. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next week.
Can you still hear me?
Oh, you're back now. You're back.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you repeat the question? I lost
Yeah,
you
yeah.
there.
So we've obviously spoke about Peak Week a lot on the podcast before with a couple of different guests. Just because it was appropriate timing for where both myself and Mike were at the time. So you said you have a kind of a bit of an unorthodox approach, and assuming a client is shredded, like they are in condition, they're ready to go. Peak week, and I've heard you say this on podcasts before, and something that we agree completely with is just about keeping all the variables the same, right? And then you can start to manipulate what you need to see the result you want. So it'd be great to sort of get your like 1,000 grams of carbs in a day sounds a lot. So kind of if there's I think that's one of the things that I get questioned on a lot is, oh Steve, how do you get so full, or how I'm worried about spilling. These are obviously common questions that everyone's worked so hard to get shredded, and they do not want to ruin it by getting full. However, that's exactly what the look that they want to achieve, isn't it?
Yeah. With Peak Week, I always tell people the approach that you should use should match how confident you are that you understand the variables. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Because I use a more drastic method with a lot of my, I'll say, bodybuilding clients. And a lot of times I'll have people hear me talk about the method that I'll use. I call it the rapid backload just because I wanted to give it a term, just so I could refer to it rather than having nothing to call it. But the rapid backload, where I essentially will deplete people, and then I do a massive carb load, where I essentially try to carb load rather than over the course of the entire week. I do it all in a single day before the show. And for male bodybuilders, this is usually in the range of maybe 900 to 950 carbs, up to 12, 13, 1400 even a couple times. And it's a lot of carbohydrates in a day. And it's not just as simple as I just feed somebody a ton of carbs in a single day and it's just a free-for-all. It's really controlled. And so I've had some people tell me that they've tried to do it, or their coach has tried to do it, and they'll essentially just try to repeat what they've seen or heard me do in the past, but they're not really understanding how the variables interconnect between carbohydrates, sodium, potassium, water. And so I always tell people you should only manipulate the variables as much as you are comfortable understanding the variables. Yeah. And so, if you're going into your first show and you are unsure about how those variables interconnect, then my approach would be keep sodium the same, keep water the same, and maybe just slightly up the carbs. If you're already super shredded, don't mess with it. Yeah. Because if you start messing with stuff and you don't understand how it's going to impact it fully, then things could go badly wrong. Yeah. So, along those methods, though, along that same line, if you do understand the variables, then you can create a positive impact on your physique. And so, I'll say that, I do the rapid backload, but you need to, and I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but, it's not just as simple as I'm feeding somebody 1,000 grams of carbohydrates the day before the show. The timing and source of those carbs are very important. Yeah. I also control the potassium number that they take in for that load, and the timing of the potassium matters as well. And then I control the amount of sodium and the timing of the sodium. So it's not just, hey, go eat 1,000 carbs, load up on some ice cream and some Pop-Tarts, and you're going to look awesome tomorrow. It's it's really controlled, and the look will also change throughout the day. So I would say And then, that's not the only method that I use. And that's another thing too, is I think with peak week, you need to understand that you shouldn't be a one-trick pony. Especially if you're a coach, you need to have other ways to peak people, because there's not always a one-size-fits-all method. For some people, I will use that rapid backload method, but other people, I don't feel like it's appropriate. And obviously, I'm not going to do that for a bikini competitor. So, some people, use a rapid backload where I bring carbs down and I'll hit them with a big spike before the show. Other people, it's just a slow build of carbohydrates over the course of the week. And some people, you'll raise it up and just sort of taper it down into the show.
Yeah.
So, I only adjust the variables as much as you are comfortable understanding how they interconnect.
So, out of interest, then, obviously the rapid backload, whereabouts did that kind of originate from? What kind of gave you the idea, or the and this was kind of something I alluded to earlier with something I've experienced recently with this, a look that I didn't essentially try to achieve, but I managed to. Whereabouts does this sort of 1,000 grams of carbohydrates come from, or what inspired that idea?
It was earlier on in my coaching career. I was using mostly front loads with people. For those that aren't familiar, a front load is where you'll bring carbohydrates up at the beginning of the week, and then you'll taper it down and usually come back up just a little bit towards the end. The goal is to sort of spill a little bit at the beginning, over carb, and then sort of clean up the spill around the middle of the week, and you can just find that good look and then hold there.
Yeah.
And I was doing that. And just visually, something that I was noticing is that the look of somebody when their carbs were coming down was not quite the same as somebody whose carbs were coming up.
Yeah.
And I think we've all experienced before. If you've been very lean, you've maybe had, you've been really lean in prep, and maybe you've had a big meal, a big refeed day, whatever it may be, and you just look at yourself, maybe even that night or the next day, and you're like, I just look crazy right now. I look so good. That's the way you want to look on stage. And I was seeing that. I kept thinking, it's got to be possible to replicate that on stage.
Yeah.
And I became, my poor wife, because I became obsessed. I became obsessed with replicating that look. And it really led me to study every variable that was going into peak week. And when I say study, I mean I was reading everything I could get my hands on. I was reading random studies done on dogs regarding potassium manipulations and glycogen depletion. I mean, I was reading just everything I could get my hands on. And I had a couple of clients that would kind of let me, that were always pretty lean, were kind of letting me play around with variables at the time. They were they were in on it, letting me tinker with things. And so I started to put together the total carbohydrate amount. So I started thinking of, okay, how many carbs are we going to need? And I played around with, there's that traditional old school peaking method where you deplete for 3 days, the glycogen supercompensation where you deplete for 3 days and then you load for 3 days. I played around with that at first, and I realized that the longer the load went, if it was an aggressive load, the more people started to risk spilling. And they kind of lost that, like I said, that look when carbs came up really aggressively.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is, but the more aggressive carbohydrates seem to come up, the tighter and fuller the look is.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I don't know the mechanistic reasons behind it, but they just look better the more aggressively carbs and calories come up. So I started off with that traditional 3-day deplete, 3-day load. I didn't care for it, and I was like, well, what if we do it all in 2 days? And so I tried loading for 2 days, more aggressively, somewhere around like 500, 600 grams of carbs. I was seeing a little bit of spilling. I was still getting that pretty pumped look that you noticed, but I was still seeing some spilling. But it was improved over the 3 days. And then finally I was just like, why don't we just do it all in one, And so I kind of started realizing that if we depleted properly, we would create a lot of supercompensation. The supercompensation effect to store more glycogen, more carbohydrates. So I I kind of noticed that we could fill it all up, but then it became the manner of, okay, because you don't just eat carbohydrates and they're instantly turned into glycogen. It takes time for those carbohydrates to assimilate and that glycogen to synthesize. So then it became really important to time it appropriately to make sure, I kind of always have to laugh when I see guys just pounding pasta like 1 hour before a stage, because that's gonna need to digest. Like that's gonna be in your stomach when you're hitting stage. It's not gonna be hitting your muscle tissue. So
yeah, hitting the vacuum's not so easy when you've got a kilo of pasta in your stomach, is it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, you see some guys that are like, I don't know what went wrong, and I'm like, you ate 5 pounds of food right before stepping on stage.
Yeah.
So once I started realizing, okay, I can do this all in one day, then it became an issue of looking at the other variables. Sodium is going to contribute to a positive look in ways that it will control blood volume. It will increase carbohydrate assimilation because carbohydrates need sodium in order to store properly, and you need a lot of sodium to get blood flowing. Kind of the same way when you increase sodium intake, your blood pressure will increase.
Yeah.
So a lot of the sodium is stored in plasma, blood plasma. And so I was like, all right, so we're going to need higher sodium levels to accommodate all of these carbs coming in very quickly. We need to speed up the process, and it'll lead to a really good pump. So then I would start looking at really high sodium levels. I mean, on the load day, usually you're looking at sodium levels in the range of 5,000 to 9,000 milligrams of sodium. And then I started looking at, well, sodium and potassium need to be in balance. You can't just add a ton of sodium because sodium is also found pretty heavily in the extracellular spaces. And so if you just add a ton of sodium and it's just too much more than potassium, what you're going to see is you're just going to see a lot of water pooling underneath the skin. So then I need to bring up potassium. And one little thing that I use during the deplete portion, where I deplete people, I will actually deplete potassium as well. Potassium is, and by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have any questions. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here.
Cliff, you keep going off at a tangent. Yeah. Keep going. Going.
Yeah, it's great. All right. So potassium, a lot of people don't realize that potassium's involved in glycogen synthesis. And so when I'm depleting people, I want to make sure we're really depleted. And people worry about deplete, they worry about muscle loss and whatnot. But I mean, how much muscle are you really going to lose in 3 or 4 days? You're not, assuming your calories are appropriate, you're not going to lose any muscle in 3 or 4 days. And so my goal was, okay, we can deplete potassium because that will also hinder glycogen storage while you're depleting. Because it'll interfere with you don't want to go to, terribly low levels, but, you don't want to be adding any foods like sweet potatoes or anything like that in there with high potassium content. So I keep potassium really low during the deplete, so it'll interfere with that glycogen storage process. And I don't know this for a fact, but like most things in the body, because I wasn't always depleting the potassium when I was doing this, but like most things in the body, there's almost a pendulum effect. If you deplete something, usually the storage ability for it increases. And so I depleted potassium, and then I'll usually load it early on in the load. So early on in the load, when they're taking in 1,000 grams of carbs, we're going to use things like sweet potatoes more often, white potatoes with higher potassium content, because whereas sodium is found mostly in the blood plasma and like the intracellular interstitial spaces, potassium is found in high concentrations inside the muscle tissue. So if you deplete it and then you load it with the carbohydrates, you're going to find a lot of water being pushed inside the muscle tissue because it's going into those intracellular spaces, and it'll remain in balance with the sodium. So then as the load goes on Friday, I'll usually start with potassium high and sodium low, and then I'll sort of switch it as the day goes on.
Okay.
So that way I've done all the loading with potassium early on in the day, and then I can taper it as the day goes on. I'll usually go with, the foods can be anything. I can go with potatoes early on in the day to get all that potassium taken care of, and then I'll maybe transition to something like Cheerios or rice cakes or something with low to moderate potassium intakes.
Yeah.
And then sodium, I just use table salt, and I'll start lower, and I'll just raise it up a little bit, adding maybe an eighth of teaspoon, fourth of teaspoon to certain meals to hit the numbers that I want later in the day.
Yeah.
And then
nice.
And then going in, yeah, and then assuming you've hit those numbers appropriately for that person, you should wake up the next day significantly fuller and just as tight, if not tighter, than when you were depleting.
Nice. And where does fat and protein come into the equation here? With so obviously when they're on their calorie load, their carbohydrate load, I assume they start to venture into a surplus at that point, right? Otherwise, they're not really going to fill out, are they? If they're still in a deficit, They're not actually going to be storing anything because they're just going to be churning through everything that you're putting in. So where does kind of protein and fats, come into the equation at this point?
I use a little bit of whey protein usually early on in the day.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too. I'll also use higher glycemic sources early on in the load. Preferably liquid sources because I early on when glycogen synthesis rates are going to be at their highest, I kind of want to keep the digestive system free and clear. So I'll use something like Gatorade, at the beginning of the load. But I'll usually mix it with some whey protein. Mm-hmm. Protein, I would say, usually ends up in the range of 90 to 120 grams during that day. You'd be surprised. The protein adds up pretty quickly just from the carbohydrate foods that you're taking in. And the same kind of goes for fats. I will keep fats mostly to the foods that I'm having them eat that day. But once again, it adds up rather quickly. So you're usually in the range of 35 to 40 grams of fat with that intake. But then on show day, there's this tendency to want to keep pounding food. But if you've eaten 1,000 grams of carbs the day before, you shouldn't need to. I've had some people eat that much and then still wake up a little bit flat the day of the show. But preferably I try to do all the loading the day before, and then I can keep a moderate intake. And I've talked about this on some podcasts before, but something with fats, I don't know exactly why, but with fats, particularly the day of the show, early on in the morning, I do find that it helps people to fill out. I don't know the exact mechanism. I know Eric Helms, who works with Jeff at 3DMJ, he and I have talked about maybe filling out some intramuscular stores of fats. But there is definitely something to having some fats before you hit the stage because it does increase the fullness, and obviously you're not going to spill with fat intake the way you can with carbohydrate intake. So I would say keep it low while loading, but then on the day of the show, it might be good to add some fats in there. Yeah,
and also it might actually slow down that oxidation of those carbohydrates, won't it? So, that's something that when I sort of spoke about earlier, I found the British finals this time, so that was my show, not the Sunday just gone, the Sunday before. I was the leanest I've ever been for that show, and I think on the day I probably had 500 grams of carbohydrates. I had 2 days loading at 600.
Nice.
And then on the day, I think I had between 400 to 500 grams of carbohydrates before the show, and then about 40 to 50 grams of fat. And then I went out for some more food. I had a burger, some fries, and a milkshake. So I didn't go crazy, but enough to put some good calories in, and I looked insane. But obviously it wasn't, a lot of the times you hear competitors go, after I woke up the next day and I looked insane. It was because they put water back in and sodium back in. But because I maintained those two variables, they were both high. Obviously, more sodium came in. And it had to be something to do with that acute aggressive response of the intake of carbohydrates, which would have been an extra few hundred grams and a lot more fat as well. And, me and Jeff sat down, we spoke about it and reflected on it. It was and he actually said to me, for your next prep, we're going to go burger and fries before just to get that acute response. But I think the fats probably there I can only speculate, are actually just slowing down that utilization of the carbohydrates, so you can just maintain that fullness.
How did you look the next day?
Next day, pretty good, but not as good as on the day. So by the time,
Well, and you nailed it. You nailed it with slowing down, the oxidation. Well, and I think people forget too, and I think this will depend on the person, because it sounds like you're a little like myself with a rather swift metabolism. And show day is kind of a stressful, hectic day. Even if you're comfortable competing, it's still kind of stressful. You're waking up early, you're moving around a lot, you got nerves going. Your caloric output is going to be so much higher than on a normal day. You're going to just keep burning through a lot of food. So you're right. I think adding a lot of that fat in on a show day just sort of keep your body from just robbing all the carbohydrates before they even reach your muscle tissue.
So, with your clients who have, they've had 1,200 grams of carbohydrates, do they go to bed looking quite, spilled or soft, or are they just looking completely insane and vascular? Are you trying to hope to get a little bit of spillage? Because obviously, if your client's asleep for 6 to 8 hours, that's going to essentially come off, right? So if you go to bed looking full, but a little bit, let's say you could have gone a little bit more, then when you wake up 8 hours later, you're just going to look flat again. So are you trying to literally get them sort of bursting, so to speak, so that, you've still got a window, haven't you, for that to calm down a little bit, for things to tighten up, for digestion to sort itself out, so that they can step on stage nice and full?
You nailed it again. It's actually something that I write in my peak week packets when I give to my clients about how they're going to look over the course of the week. All right, you're going to look like this midweek during your deplete. You're going to feel like this. You're going to look like this. You're going to feel like this. Starting your load, you're going to look like this. You're going to feel like this. Midday, you're going to look like this. You're going to feel like this. And then end of day, you're going to look like this. And you're going to feel like this. And you're absolutely right. I do aim to. You're going to see. There's a couple of variables that I use to track how somebody's load is going. When they're loading, it's kind of a crucial process. So I actually have them check in with me multiple times per day, the day before the show, because I want to see how things are progressing and, make sure it's going as I anticipate. And so I will usually start to see some blurring, a little bit of spilling towards the end of the day. And I think this is really for two reasons. One, when you're feeding somebody that number of carbohydrates, the spilling is usually also going to be from the inability to keep up with the rate of storage.
Yeah.
It's when you have that many carbohydrates coming in at once, sometimes the body cannot synthesize that much glycogen that quickly.
Yeah.
And so, I usually let the amount of blurring that I see on Friday tell me how well their body's keeping up with everything. And like you said, if somebody's really sharp when they're going to bed, I know they're going to wake up flat. So I will sort of intentionally try to spill them. And, the meals that they eat at the end of the day are not going to be seen immediately. I won't be seeing that happen until the end of the next morning. Yeah. So I do look to see a little bit of blurring going on by the end of the day. I obviously don't want to see like massive spilling, in which case, that's not a good thing. So far, that's never been an issue.
Nice, yeah. And do you play around with fructose much? I know there's some recent research come out from a friend of mine who's a lecturer at Bath, who's starting to look at this sort of mechanism where fructose allows for a greater absorption of glucose as well. So we can start to. It's obviously mainly done in endurance athletes, but is fructose something you play around with, or is it is not something you have particularly looked at?
I do use a little bit of fructose. I'll have people take in some sort of fruit to begin their load.
Yeah.
Mainly to fill out liver glycogen.
Yeah.
Because for those that don't know, and it sounds like your friend might have some new research coming out, or so you may be able to tell me a few things that I don't know. But I usually use the fructose because the fructose is mainly just going to fill out liver glycogen. So I'll usually do that to start. so that way we can restock liver glycogen without necessarily jumping the gun on muscle glycogen
nice.
to begin. And then I'll usually start the next day, show day, with a little bit of fruit. But then for the rest of the load and the rest of the show day, I try to stay away from fruit, just because, once the liver glycogen's been restocked, I figure I'll just leave it alone.
Yeah.
But depending on what research might be coming out, I may need to reevaluate that approach.
No, it literally goes again like perfect. Really, is as far as I understand it. And I'll probably try and get Javi on at some point to sort of speak about this a little bit more, and then maybe we can get his take on what he's doing in the research, and then go, how might this apply? It might actually go back to where you're loading in the morning is actually. It was a lecture that he presented on the ISSN a while ago, so I'm trying to recall from a few months back. But essentially, it allows for it kind of opens up another pathway to allow more glucose uptake, so they can get glucose in it at a quicker rate. So actually, by doing that in the morning is probably one of the better routes to do things, just so you can get a greater absorption. And I think that's why they saw an increased amount over just, for example, glucose alone. So yeah, sounds like
awesome.
It sounds like what you've been doing again in the practice is already kind of ahead of where things are at. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Nice. So we kind of that was amazing. Really, really good. We couldn't really ask for a more sort of succinct peak week. Now, do you find then with a client coming off the back of a show, they're going to go out for a nice meal, that celebratory meal. Do you then find, because of, water's been really high, potassium, obviously you may have changed slightly, sodium may have been a little bit higher. Do you find that they start to hold a little bit of water, which might be more than what you might normally expect? Is there any recommendations you've put in there? Something that I've noticed with myself, I kind of, just look a little bit softer, and it's not to do with the amount of calories I ate, because you could look at that and go, there's no possible way that I should look or have gained this much weight based on the amount of food and the amount of exercise. So there might be some other variables going on there, like water retention, because obviously, maybe I haven't kept up with my 7 liters a day that I was having in the amount of sodium maybe. Is that something that you've experienced with clients?
I'll say this, that if they don't go out to eat the night of the show, because I have had some clients where they have 2-day shows, which is a pain in the butt, by the way. But they have 2-day shows. I know I can do the rapid backload, have them peaked for show day, and then if we keep a more moderate intake, they will wake up the next day looking mostly the same. I would say usually maybe not quite as full, but the weight is significantly higher, particularly on show day, just because we've given them a lot of water, a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sodium, a lot of potassium, just a lot of solutes that are going to draw water. And so I always say that I aim to have as much water in their body as possible, as long as it can be stored in the right compartments. And so they will see an abnormally high weight on show day. And it is a balancing act. So I think a lot of times if you are peaked correctly, if you go out to have a meal that night, even if it's somewhat moderate, usually it will tip things over the edge of where they need to be. Like, if you're having just as much sodium as you can have to look really good, then you go out for a big, usually it's a salty meal. And if you're having just as many carbohydrates as you can tolerate, like, our goal is to get to the limit with pretty much everything and still look good. But then, you go out after the show and you have a heavy carb, sodium meal.
Fat meal.
It's probably going to, it's going to push everything over the edge, and you're going to wake up the next day looking pretty rough. And so, I always tell people, I always try to tell my clients, like, remember, we have pushed everything to your capacity with your peak week. And so anything that you have after the show is going to push you over that edge. And so you need to be prepared for whatever, you might want to play it a little more moderate, and then use the next day to sort of gauge how you're looking and how much you can have.
Yeah, nice. No, good. No, that's perfect. And again, it comes down to experience, doesn't it? To be able to sort of have that forward approach with your clients to say, look, this is what you're going to expect, and they can kind of feel a little bit of ease to see that jump up in weight and or whatever it might be. So yeah, no, that's brilliant. So yeah, something that I kind of wanted to kind of pick your brains on in this. You might have already answered this anyway, but obviously it's been spoke about in terms of training, the minimum effective dose of training versus the maximal recovery amount. Now, could we also apply that to a diet? So is it a case of just chipping away a small amount, like kind of it sounds like you did over, and what I did over a longer prep? So just looking for those marginal amounts, or actually kind of picking your spots where you can go, I know I can dig at this level. I know where I'm comfortable on calories being. And rather than kind of bringing them gradually, is there maybe benefit at the initial start to go, right, I'm going to go straight off the bat here. Well, I'm feeling good. Performance is good. Or, have you tried these different methods? And it'd just be good to get your, yeah.
Yeah. I base a lot of what I do on body type and what I see from the person that I'm working with. And so for someone like myself, I mean, for those that, I'm kind of covered up and those that haven't seen me, I'm naturally a really thin guy.
Yeah.
And I don't retain muscle very well at all. And I know that when I start dieting, I lose strength really quickly. I lose muscle really quickly. And so for someone like myself, I usually like the very slow, gradual chipping away at it. I try to avoid, and usually guys like myself, while we don't retain muscle pretty well, usually we can lose weight pretty easily. But I always tell people, just because you can lose weight easily does not mean you should, because it's probably going to lead faster weight loss will probably lead to more muscle loss in someone like myself. So for someone like myself, if you're more of a ectomorphic type, I would recommend slow, steady. Try to avoid at any point feeling like you're pushing. It should be organic, and keep that pace, because that's going to suit you well in terms of how you look on stage. But I think we all know those people that are the opposite of me. They grow just by looking at a weight. You know what I mean? And they never seem to get that really flat look, no matter how hard they push with their diet. In those cases, I will recommend a harder push at the beginning of their prep, because we can minimize diet time, and they don't usually see that dip in strength, that loss of muscle. So I'll go with a harder approach at the beginning of prep. 2 pounds of 2 pounds of weight loss per week, maybe a little bit higher up to 2.2. But as we get closer to show day, I try to slow that rate of loss. One thing to keep in mind is the leaner you get, the more likely your body is to start tapping into muscle tissue for energy.
Yeah.
Because when fat stores get low, muscle tissue will just look more enticing. Hormonally, it's gonna also not be. I mean, for those that aren't aware, I've done tests, and we're talking natural bodybuilders here, but of all the hormone panels that I've ever done with my clients, taking things extremely slow and moderate and not doing anything extreme, the average 25 to 30-year-old male is going to end up with testosterone somewhere resembling a 70-year-old man. It's just going to happen. You're going to see losses of roughly 70%, maybe 75% drop in testosterone. So muscle loss is going to be a really big threat at the end of prep. So I would rather push hard at the beginning when muscle loss isn't really a big threat, and then sort of coast at the end when it is. And so, even the big guys that retain muscle really well, at the end of prep, they're in danger of losing muscle as well. So, kind of grade yourself on that scale. If you tend to lose muscle easily, try to avoid pushing too hard at any point. But if you retain muscle really well, you push hard in the beginning and then coast towards the end.
Yeah, Cliff, you've literally just summed up me and Mike there. I'm very much like yourself. And Mike, I would say, is quite the opposite. Can be more aggressive, and just looks at a weight and gains muscle. And it actually reflects our preps, doesn't it, Mike? And we both, give it a couple of weeks, I think achieved a very similar body composition at the end, didn't we? In terms of how much fat-free mass we had.
Well, we prepped for the same amount of time, but I was a lot more aggressive than you were in terms of weight loss. Going back to that, in terms of like length of prep, so would you say that the amount of muscle that you retain in a longer prep would outweigh the benefit of spending a longer period in the surplus and having a shorter prep?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you're an experienced trainee, I would say definitely. Yeah. Because if you're looking, guys don't like to hear these numbers, but if you've been training for, let's say, 8 years, I mean, realistically, you might be looking at a pound of muscle a year growth. So so many guys are like, I don't want to diet for 20 weeks. I'll cut it down to 12. Yeah. How much muscle are you going to gain in that 8 weeks? It's a fraction of a pound. But I've seen a few body composition tests from really drastic measures to a more coasting method where you just sort of take the losses as they come. I mean, you can retain. I've seen 4 or 5 pounds of difference in lean mass retention, and that's significant. That shows. And I'll even say, besides just and there's another one, I don't know what causes the difference in the look, but besides just the retention of physical lean mass, there's a different look to somebody that's gone slower than somebody who has crash dieted to a certain point. There's a tightness to their skin. There's a fullness that comes along with it. Sometimes even if it doesn't, you're not even looking at pounds on the scale. When I'm looking at people on stage, I can spot, even if they're very lean, I can spot the ones that went down there slowly and gradually, and I can spot the ones that went down there rapidly, because there's just a small, subtle difference in the tightness of their skin and the fullness that they bring. I can't pinpoint exactly what it is or how to explain it completely, but there's a preferred look to those that go a little bit slower.
Yeah, I found with my prep, actually, from the Welsh that I did with Mike to the British finals that I did, the protocol that we adopted didn't change, but I just didn't look as flat at any point. I just kind of maintained my fullness, actually, but my condition just got better every single week. But at no point were me and Jeff looking at the pictures going, oh, I'm looking really, really flat here. I still had good muscle bellies, and I just kind of seemed to just look great compared to, for example, how I might have done last year, where I had those days where I looked really, really flat because I had a much shorter prep. So anecdotally from my experience, I can completely get on board with that. And what you've said makes perfect sense about what you can gain in 8 weeks compared to what you might be able to retain in that 8 weeks. It's kind of out, do the pros outweigh the cons. So and you've already again hit it on the head. So maybe a newbie to might be more, they might see better off gains having a longer off season and a shorter prep, but someone with more experience and a bit older might do the kind of the opposite in the reverse, really, and focus more on retention rather than gains. So it's horses for courses again, isn't it?
But then with a newbie, you'd probably want to give a longer prep anyway, because you don't know what weight they're going to be on stage, and also the psychological aspects anyway. So it looks like maybe the longer prep is the way to go for both beginner and experience.
And generally, I would say that most beginning people, their first prep's their hardest because they generally have the most body fat to lose. Because once you've done a show, I like to stay fairly close, within 10 to 12 kilos of my stage weight. It sounds like you're around 15 kilos, like 30 pounds-ish. You know that you're not too far away, whereas your first prep, maybe not you, Mike, but...
Or you third.
I think that's it. The first prep for most people is their hardest because they've got the most amount of body fat to lose, because they don't understand how much they actually have to lose to get stage lean.
As evidenced by the picture I just put up on Facebook, where I did that massive bulk. Even even though I was still using a scientific approach, I was drastically misjudging how much I was going to weigh on stage at my first show. I was like, I got up to like 222 pounds. And I was like, oh yeah, I think I'll definitely weigh 180. And then I had to diet down to 156, and it was horribly misjudged.
Yeah,
that's brilliant.
That's the same with me. When I first competed, I thought, I've got 10 kilos to lose. I needed to lose like 21 or something. So and then you get the guys going, I'm getting really skinny. I'm losing muscle. It's like, no, you're just losing fat. But when you were filling your t-shirt out and you thought you were the big guy in the gym, it's just body fat.
Just gotta fill out the sleeves. For any first-time competitors listening, if you want to know how to judge your body weight, what you're going to be on stage, take what you think you're going to weigh and then subtract about like 12 to 15 pounds. That's usually a good way to go with it, because you're probably over judging how much you're going to weigh.
Mm-hmm.
No, and on that bombshell, I think we should probably maybe call it a night. I know we've had you on for an hour and a half now, and what I'll probably do is split this into 2 parts, if you don't mind, Cliff, and then that way, we can kind of keep it around the 45-minute episode length, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I apologize because I probably went off on a couple of rants.
No,
I was talking too much.
I don't want to keep you. I'm sure you've got a nice evening planned, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm trying to be respectful of that. And for us, it's midnight now, so we need to get some shut eye. But honestly, thank you so much for coming on. What you've shared has been absolutely unbelievable, and a huge honor to have you on the show.
Oh, I appreciate it. Like I said, it was my pleasure, and you guys asked some great questions, so it was good talking to you.
Brilliant. And if you ever want to come on again, just let us know, and we'd love to have you on. Maybe we can talk about an off-season or something, a topic completely different. So,
Absolutely. Anytime.
Great. Well, thanks again, Cliff.